This night should have been filled with laughter, dancing, and joy. But instead, this night marked the beginning of a chilling and terrible mystery. This terrible secret would haunt an entire nation. The woman disappeared into the shadows. Her last minutes of life spent in a crowded nightclub. She was seen talking to a man she had just met. And then, as if swallowed by the darkness, she vanished. The discovery of her belongings on the side of the road a few days later compounded the mystery, sparking fear and wild speculation. Her purse, shoes, and identification were found, but she was gone. The perpetrator had acted coldly and methodically. The police were shocked, the city panicked, and the families desperate. But unfortunately, the nightmare for the family was just beginning. 3 years of investigation uncovered secrets that made the blood run cold. One of the most high-profile and controversial trials in Uruguay's history raised more questions than it answered. Natalia Martinez was born in the late 1980s in Montedo, the bustling capital of Uruguay. As the youngest daughter in the Martinez family, she was cherished by her parents and formed a particularly close bond with her older sister, Claudia. The family lived in comfort thanks to their father, who worked as a senior salesman for a large international company that specialized in household appliances. Their home was filled with the luxuries of life, and this affluence allowed Natalia to grow up without material concerns. From a young age, Natalia was known to be a cheerful and friendly girl, though not much else is widely documented about her early personality. What was clear to those who knew her was the deep affection she shared with her family, especially her sister. Claudia, being older, often played the role of protector and confidant, and the two sisters were nearly inseparable. The Martinez family, as a whole, was known for their close-knit relationships, and Natalia fit perfectly into this dynamic. As Natalia grew into her teenage years, her warm and sociable nature became more apparent. She built a tight circle of friends, a group that remained loyal and close throughout the years. This group became a second family to her, individuals she could rely on and who could rely on her in return. They stuck together in times of trouble, never abandoning each other, and later described Natalia as a person who could effortlessly connect with anyone. She was never shy or hesitant, and finding common ground with strangers was a skill she mastered naturally. After graduating from high school, Natalia's social life continued to flourish. She spent more time with her friends, and they frequently attended parties, enjoying the vibrant nightlife of the area. Eventually, their adventures expanded beyond the city. The group began taking regular trips to the coast of Uruguay, indulging in the sun, sand, and sea. These vacations were filled with laughter and activity, and they relished the freedom of youth. On January 1, 2007, as Natalia turned 19, she and her friends decided to embark on another one of their adventurous getaways. To celebrate her birthday, they set off for La Paloma City, a small resort town known for its relaxed vibe and beautiful beaches. For the next 2 weeks, they stayed there, soaking in the atmosphere and making memories. On January 16th, the group made their way to a second resort, this time in the city of Rales. The plan was for Natalia to reunite with her parents and sister, who were vacationing in Paz, a nearby town. The Martinez family often took trips like this, and the locals knew them well from their frequent visits. They had a sense of belonging in these small coastal towns, always returning to the same places that made them feel at home. On January 18, just a few days before their trip was to end, Natalia and Claudia decided to take a road trip to Puna del Este, another tourist town less than an hour away from Paz. Their destination was a well-known local spa nestled in the Cerro San Antonio area, situated midway between the two towns. The sisters spent the day enjoying beauty treatments and pampering themselves, their minds set on capping the evening with a night of dancing at a nearby disco. They had planned to meet up with Natalia's close friends, Rosalia and Natalia Silva, for a night out on the town. However, as the evening wore on, Claudia began to feel fatigued. She decided to return to their parents and skip the party, leaving 19-year-old Natalia to carry on with their plans. Natalia, determined not to let the night go to waste, joined her friends at La Arenas Canada nightclub, a locally famous venue where they danced until the early morning hours. Around 5 a.m., as the party finally wound down, the group of friends decided it was time to head home. But before they could leave, Natalia got caught up in a conversation with Leonardo Rakovic, an old acquaintance who owned a bookstore in town. The two stood near the exit, talking quietly, while Rosalia and Natalia Silva lingered nearby, waiting for their friend. The night had been long, and they were tired, but they didn't want to leave without Natalia. As the minutes ticked by and their friend's conversation stretched on, Rosalia and Natalia Silva decided to head outside and wait in the car. They figured their friend would join them shortly. After all, they had an unspoken rule. They never left anyone behind. But time passed, and Natalia still hadn't appeared. Growing restless and concerned, they decided to return to the club and see what was causing the delay. When they re-entered the nightclub, there was no sign of Natalia Martinez or Leonardo. The spot where they had been talking was empty. A sense of unease began to creep in. Natalia wasn't the type to leave without telling her friends. If there had been a change of plans, she would have called or, at the very least, told them in person. But they had heard nothing from her. The friends decided to search the club from top to bottom. They made their way upstairs to the second floor, hoping for a better view of the parking lot from the balcony. That's when they spotted Leonardo's BMW parked below. The car was running, its engine idling, and through the glare on the glass, Rosalia and Natalia Silva couldn't quite make out the details inside. However, they thought they saw movement in the passenger seat. Something or someone shifting inside the car. Their hearts raced. Something didn't feel right. The night, which had started as a carefree celebration, was now tinged with an unsettling sense of dread. The girls were growing anxious as they called out to Leonardo, hoping for some answers. They asked him about Natalia, and he calmly claimed that he was just sitting in his car with a friend at the time. He explained that after a brief conversation with Natalia inside the club, they had parted ways. He insisted he had no clue where she went afterward or why she hadn't returned to her friends. Unsure of what else to do, the girls speculated that Natalia might have already headed home. With this thought in mind, they got into the car and drove to her relatives, just 10 minutes away from the club. When they arrived outside the house, they honked their car horn softly, trying to get Claudia's attention without disturbing the entire family. But there was no response. After a few more tries, they decided to turn back and return to the club, retracing their steps to the last place they had seen Natalia. They resumed their search, scouring the area for nearly 2 hours, but their efforts were in vain. No one had any information about where she had gone, and the anxiety only grew. By 8 a.m., Natalia Silva, exhausted and distraught, finally made her way home. Though physically drained, her mind was racing with worry. She shared her concerns with her parents, fearing that something terrible had happened to her friend. They tried to comfort her, urging her to get some rest, insisting that Natalia Martinez had likely returned home safely and that there was no need to panic. Reluctantly, Natalia Silva went to bed, but the nagging fear in her heart persisted. When she awoke at 11 a.m., the same day, her worst fears were confirmed. There was still no word from Natalia Martinez. Panic set in. The entire Martinez family, alarmed and desperate, launched an immediate search for her. Her friends, equally worried, joined in. Together, they went back to the club, retracing her steps, hoping to find any clue that might lead them to her whereabouts. Unfortunately, the club was now closed, and no one in the surrounding area could provide any helpful information. They searched every corner, but nothing turned up. By 5 p.m., realizing they had exhausted all their resources, the family and friends went to the police station in Maldonado. They handed over several photos, including one from that fateful night showing the girls together at the club. This provided the police with a clear picture of what Natalia was wearing that evening, and an all-points bulletin, APB, was issued. The police began their investigation, though their initial skepticism was evident. It wasn't uncommon for young girls at parties to leave without informing friends, especially after consuming alcohol. They wondered if Natalia had simply left with a man she'd met at the club. However, Rosalia and Natalia Silva were adamant Natalia hadn't been drinking that night. In fact, she had a strong aversion to alcohol and rarely touched it. Furthermore, they firmly denied any use of illegal substances. Under pressure from both the family and Natalia's friends, the detective in charge began to take the case more seriously. The first step in the investigation was to return to the nightclub where Natalia Martinez had last been seen. By now, the club was open, but there were no CCTV cameras installed at the time, making it difficult to track her movements inside or outside the venue. While speaking with the staff, the detectives learned that a group of 3 young men had been sitting at a nearby table, and they had spent the evening trying to engage with Natalia and her friends. Rosalia and Silva confirmed that the men had been persistently bothering them throughout the night. Despite this new information, the investigators chose to focus their attention on Leonardo, the last person known to have spoken with Natalia before her disappearance. It wasn't surprising that he quickly became the prime suspect. After all, he had been seen talking with her just moments before she vanished, and the lack of leads only heightened suspicion around him. Leonardo, however, maintained his innocence. He had a reputation as a kind and mild-mannered individual, and none of his friends or acquaintances could recall a single instance of him ever displaying aggressive or cruel behavior. When questioned, he explained again that his conversation with Natalia had ended peacefully. After her friends left, she had walked down the stairs and out onto the porch, at which point Leonardo returned to his car to chat with his friend. He claimed that he saw Natalia leaving, but soon lost sight of her because he became engrossed in conversation with a friend. He had no reason to believe anything was amiss. There was no commotion, no shouting, nothing that would raise alarm. Despite Leonardo's insistence that he had nothing to do with her disappearance, detectives remained unconvinced. They decided to thoroughly investigate his BMW, the car he had driven away from the club that night. Witnesses had reported seeing a similar vehicle in various locations around the city, including on the outskirts near a wooded area. One particularly intriguing report came from a man who claimed to have seen a couple engaging in intimate activity inside a car near a lake close to the woods. The description of the vehicle matched Leonardo's BMW, and the sighting allegedly occurred on the night of Natalia Martinez's disappearance. As detectives pieced together these scattered accounts, the mystery deepened. Leonardo's version of events seemed plausible, yet the growing circumstantial evidence was impossible to ignore. The investigation was only beginning, but the clock was ticking, and Natalia's family feared the worst. The police, armed with a search warrant, thoroughly examined Leonardo's BMW. Almost immediately, they found strands of long, dark hair on the floor of the vehicle. The discovery raised hopes, and the hair was sent for forensic testing. To the detectives' surprise, it didn't match the missing Natalia Martinez. It belonged to someone else entirely. The interior of the car was also remarkably clean. There were no bloodstains, no signs of a struggle, nothing to directly connect Leonardo to Natalia's disappearance. However, the detectives, already suspicious of him, assumed he had meticulously cleaned the car after the incident, erasing any potential evidence. This theory was even noted in their reports, adding to the circumstantial evidence against Leonardo. Still, there was nothing concrete, and it wasn't enough to warrant an arrest. Then, on January 22nd, a crucial break in the case occurred. A passerby driving along the highway on the outskirts of Paz noticed several items scattered on the roadside. Among them was a woman's purse, a wallet, and a pair of shoes. But what truly stood out was an ID card, belonging to none other than the missing Natalia Martinez. Recognizing the significance of the find, the passerby immediately contacted the police, who arrived swiftly on the scene. The discovery sent shockwaves through the investigation, providing the first tangible clue of Natalia's fate. However, the intense media coverage surrounding Natalia's disappearance also had its drawbacks. As the public became more engrossed in the case, wild rumors began to circulate. One particularly damaging rumor suggested that Natalia had ties to drug traffickers and had fallen victim to a violent dispute between rival dealers. These rumors were baseless, but they gained traction quickly, forcing Natalia's family to respond publicly. Her father appeared on television, vehemently denying any connection between his daughter and criminal activities. Despite his efforts, the rumors continued to spread, casting a shadow over the investigation. In addition to fueling speculation, the media frenzy led to a flood of false reports. Anonymous tips poured into the police station, each one more outlandish than the last. Some callers claimed they had seen Natalia, while others insisted they had witnessed her abduction. Still, others provided dubious details about the crime itself. The detectives, already stretched thin, were forced to investigate each lead only to find most were dead ends. The sheer volume of misinformation severely hindered their progress. Yet the media thrived on these dramatic twists and turns, as the public's fascination with the case grew. Headlines blared with theories and sensational claims, adding pressure to an already strained investigation. Despite the setbacks, the search for Natalia intensified. Law enforcement officials, friends, family, and hundreds of volunteers scoured the countryside, hoping to find any trace of the missing woman. The area surrounding the nightclub was combed thoroughly, but no clues were found. As the days passed, the search expanded to more remote parts of Uruguay, including coastal regions and forested areas. Specialized search units, including service dogs and even military aviation, were called in to assist. The local fire department scoured sewer systems. But still, there was no sign of Natalia. By late January, the grim reality had set in for the authorities. Natalia Martinez was most likely dead. The critical 48-hour window for finding missing persons had long passed, and with no new leads, hope was fading fast. On Grand Beach, a discovery was made that briefly stirred the investigation. A bone was found. But after careful analysis, it was determined that the bone was not human, dashing the faint hopes of the searchers. Yet Natalia's family remained steadfast. They refused to give up, clinging to the belief that she was still alive, perhaps being held against her will. This hope sustained them through the grueling weeks of fruitless searches. But on February 10th, 2007, their worst fears were realized. A woman's body was discovered in the dense woods near Willow Lake, just 2 miles from the club where Natalia had last been seen. The condition of the body was poor, badly decomposed after weeks exposed to the elements, but the clothing matched what Natalia had been wearing the night she disappeared. Detectives felt a sinking certainty that they had found the missing young woman. The discovery triggered memories of a previous eyewitness report. Someone had seen a couple in a car near that very wooded area, engaged in what appeared to be an intimate encounter. The sighting had occurred on the night of Natalia's disappearance, and the vehicle matched the description of Leonardo's BMW. With this new piece of the puzzle, investigators returned to their prime suspect, even as they awaited the results of the forensic examination of the body. The body was sent for a detailed autopsy, but the medical examiners faced significant challenges due to its advanced state of decomposition. 5 different forensic experts were brought in to carefully analyze the remains. Despite the difficulties, they were able to confirm that the body was indeed that of Natalia Martinez. Further examination revealed subtle signs of strangulation on her neck, leading the medical team to conclude that she had likely died from asphyxiation. Toxicology reports ruled out both alcohol and drug poisoning as potential causes of death. However, due to the poor condition of the body, it was impossible to determine whether Natalia had been sexually assaulted, leaving the possibility open. One particularly disturbing detail emerged during the examination. Natalia's body had been bound with nylon thread. The experts were unable to determine whether this binding had occurred before or after her death, adding another layer of mystery to an already perplexing case. Despite the extensive autopsy, many questions remained unanswered. Yet, it was clear that Natalia had met a violent end, and the investigation now focused on finding her killer. Though the discovery of Natalia's body provided closure to her family, it also marked the beginning of a new phase in the investigation. Because Leonardo was still under suspicion, and new evidence pointed to him, detectives faced mounting pressure to solve the case and get justice for Natalia Martinez. A few months after the discovery of Natalia Martinez's body, the case took a dark and unexpected turn. Ruben Olive, the man who had originally discovered her belongings by the side of the road, was found dead near his home at the base of a cliff. At first glance, authorities were inclined to label it as a suicide. But those close to Ruben, including his family and friends, were adamant that this was impossible. Ruben was deeply religious, cherished life, and was devoted to his family. He had never shown signs of despair or suicidal thoughts. An autopsy later confirmed their suspicions. Ruben had died from blunt force trauma to the head, sustained before his fall from the cliff. It was clear now. He had been murdered. His death raised chilling questions about whether it was connected to Natalia's case. As if that wasn't tragic enough, the next loss sent further ripples of sorrow through the Martinez family. Natalia's father, Everett Martinez, fell into a profound depression following his daughter's death. He was haunted by the grisly details of her murder, as well as the malicious rumors spread by the media, some suggesting that Natalia had ties to criminal activity. Unable to cope with the weight of his grief and the incessant public scrutiny, Everett took his own life. He shot himself in the head at his home. His body was discovered by his daughter, Claudia, and his wife, deepening the trauma for the family. The police quickly closed the case, confirming that Everett's death was a suicide. The family, while devastated, did not contest this conclusion. For months, the investigation into Natalia's murder stalled, and it seemed like there would be no justice. But in 2010, nearly 3 years after her death, detectives stumbled upon new evidence that reignited the case. This new lead came from an overlooked source: Natalia's personal correspondence. The messages, exchanged with a close friend just days before her death, revealed that she had met a man online who she was planning to meet at the club the night she disappeared. Astonishingly, detectives had missed this crucial information for years. It was unclear why it had taken so long to access Natalia's digital records, but the delay had cost the investigation precious time. As detectives reviewed the messages, they realized that the man Natalia had mentioned was one of the same 3 young men who had been pestering her and her friends at the club that night. These men had been identified early in the investigation, with several witnesses, including the bartender, pointing them out as behaving suspiciously. Yet, for reasons that were unclear, this information had been overlooked or dismissed. With renewed vigor, detectives tracked down and identified the 3 men. They were all slightly older than Natalia, and their involvement in the case suddenly became a focal point. When questioned, the men seemed nervous and confused. Their accounts of where they had been and what they had done on the night of Natalia's murder were contradictory. Their stories didn't match up, and this raised further suspicion. The police also managed to track down one critical witness, a girlfriend of one of the men. For her own safety, her identity was kept secret, but she provided crucial information. One of the men, Rodrigo Verchis, had confessed to her that he had been involved in Natalia's death. Rodrigo, 25 years old at the time, had been evasive from the start. During previous interrogations, he had lied to detectives, providing false information about his whereabouts. But this new testimony, combined with phone records that placed him at key locations near the time of Natalia's disappearance, painted a different picture. DNA samples were taken from Rodrigo, but due to the condition of Natalia's remains, they were of limited use. Nevertheless, investigators now had enough to consider him the prime suspect. Rodrigo was called back in for further questioning on June 8, 2010. His friends, who had been with him at the nightclub on the night in question, were also interrogated. They all denied having anything to do with Natalia's death. They claimed that after leaving the nightclub, they had hired escorts to continue their night of partying. However, Rodrigo's story quickly began to unravel. Initially, he denied ever having met or interacted with Natalia. But detectives confronted him with the damning evidence of her online messages, proving that they had known each other and had arranged to meet at the club that night. Under pressure, Rodrigo's facade crumbled. The next day, he returned to the station and finally told the truth. He admitted that he had met Natalia online and that they had exchanged messages before agreeing to meet at the club. However, things hadn't gone as he had hoped. As the night wore on, Rodrigo became frustrated that their conversation wasn't going well. In the early hours of the morning, he suggested that they leave the club and go to another venue nearby. But this was a lie. His real intention was to get Natalia alone. Rodrigo then led her to a remote area under false pretenses, intending to take advantage of her. The investigation had finally uncovered the truth, but it left everyone with a bitter sense of injustice. Rodrigo had lured Natalia away from her friends with ill intentions. When Rodrigo began to harass Natalia that night, things took a dark turn. According to his confession, she rejected his advances, and he claimed to have accepted it calmly. He further stated that Natalia suffered an asthma attack due to the excitement, followed by convulsions. Without her inhaler or any medication, she tragically died in front of him. Rodrigo claimed that he was confused and panicked, unable to offer any help. His fear intensified when Natalia stopped showing signs of life in his car. After the party, Rodrigo was supposed to return to his family's farm near the city. But faced with a dead body, he chose to cover up the incident rather than seek help. On a road toward the woods, he pulled over, dragged Natalia's body deep into the trees, tied her up with nylon thread, and threw branches over her in a feeble attempt to conceal the crime. However, his story was riddled with inconsistencies, and many believed he was hiding the truth. A witness walking on the beach had previously claimed to have seen the pair engaged in intimate relations, and signs of strangulation found during an autopsy indicated coercion. It was highly likely that Rodrigo omitted a crucial detail, that he had strangled Natalia after failing to get what he wanted. His initial intentions seemed clear. He had hoped for intimacy, and when rejected, things escalated. The forensic evidence suggested more than just an accidental death, but given the state of Natalia's body, proving molestation was no longer possible. What puzzled investigators was why Rodrigo hadn't called for help. If Natalia had suffered a genuine asthma attack, any reasonable person would have tried to save her life by contacting emergency services. A simple call for medical assistance might have saved her, or at least cleared his name. The fact that he hid the body instead of seeking help only reinforced the suspicion that he was hiding something far darker than he admitted. A key element that contributed to the confusion during the investigation was the car Rodrigo had been driving that night, a Chevrolet Corsa. Coincidentally, this car was strikingly similar in appearance to a BMW of the same era, especially in the dim light of night. Both vehicles were dark maroon, making it easy for several witnesses to mistake Rodrigo's car for the BMW belonging to Leonardo Radakovich, the bookstore owner who had been a prime suspect early on. This led to a string of false leads that wasted valuable time. Once Rodrigo confessed, however, his friends, who had been with him that night, were cleared of any involvement and released. Meanwhile, Rodrigo was placed under arrest, awaiting trial. His parents were concerned about his safety in prison, fearing retaliation from violent inmates, but the warden reassured them that he would be protected. At first, it seemed as though Rodrigo's confession would make the prosecutor's job straightforward. But in mid-2010, during preliminary hearings, Rodrigo recanted his confession, claiming he had only admitted to the crime under intense police pressure. He insisted that he was innocent. Despite his claims, his confession had been too detailed. He had shared information only the killer would know, including the exact location of Natalia's body. His sudden change of heart raised suspicion, but his defense team swiftly rallied behind his new plea. Rodrigo's lawyers attempted to dismantle the prosecution's case by arguing that he hadn't even been at the nightclub that night. They presented phone records and statements from his employer to suggest that Rodrigo had been working a shift that evening, making it impossible for him to have been at the scene of the crime. They further claimed that the following day, Rodrigo had attended a friend's wedding, where no one noticed any unusual behavior from him. The defense's argument took a hit when Leonardo Radakovich, who had been cleared earlier, was called as a witness for the prosecution. He testified that, on the night of Natalia's disappearance, she had repeatedly glanced away from him toward a young man in the club, now confirmed to be Rodrigo. This, coupled with testimony from Natalia's friends who identified Rodrigo, placed him at the scene, effectively discrediting the defense's alibi. The prosecution also leaned heavily on the findings of the medical examiner. According to the autopsy, Natalia's asthma could not have caused her death so quickly. While she did suffer from asthma, it would have taken hours, not minutes, for an attack to kill her. The more likely cause of death, based on the strangulation marks found on her neck, was manual strangulation. Unfortunately, due to the condition of the body, the medical examiner was unable to provide further details about the injuries, but the evidence that did exist pointed away from Rodrigo's story of an accidental death. 3 years of investigation had yielded enough evidence to challenge Rodrigo's claims. The prosecution argued that Natalia, a cautious young woman, would never have willingly gone anywhere with a man she didn't trust. This indicated that Rodrigo had either tricked her or forced her into accompanying him that night. Furthermore, the way he disposed of her body was cold and methodical, not the actions of someone in a state of panic. Forensic experts concluded that Rodrigo had likely killed her intentionally and then tried to cover up the crime by hiding her body in the woods. In the end, Rodrigo's attempts to claim innocence only added to the tragedy. His recantation cast doubt, but the overwhelming evidence, his confession, his detailed knowledge of the crime, and the testimony from witnesses, pointed to his guilt. The question remained: would the court see through his final desperate attempt to escape responsibility for Natalia's death? Or would justice finally be served for the young woman whose life was cut short in such a brutal and senseless manner? The hearings for the murder of Natalia Martinez took place from late August to mid-September 2010. During the trial, the prosecution meticulously crafted a narrative, painting Rodrigo Vergés as the perpetrator with a clear motive for the crime. After examining the evidence and testimonies, the court found Rodrigo guilty of murder and sentenced him to 9 years in prison. Many believed justice had finally been served for the brutal death of Natalia. However, just a few months later, in February 2011, Rodrigo's defense team, led by his persistent lawyer, filed an appeal. The defense argued that the court's decision was fundamentally flawed and accused the prosecution of bias. According to the defense, the entire case had been fabricated, and Rodrigo was merely a scapegoat in a miscarriage of justice. In a surprising turn of events, on October 27, 2014, the appeal bore fruit. Rodrigo, who had only served 4 years and 2 months of his 9-year sentence, was eligible for parole. Despite the gravity of the crime, he was granted an early release, largely due to his good behavior during his time in prison. This decision sparked outrage, particularly among those who firmly believed that Rodrigo had taken Natalia's life. The swift release of a convicted murderer left many questioning the justice system and the weight it placed on punishment for such a heinous crime. Rodrigo's father, Miguel Vergés, was one of the most vocal advocates for his son's innocence. Throughout the trial and Rodrigo's incarceration, Miguel maintained that his son had been framed. He insisted that Rodrigo was not the murderer, and the court's decision was a mistake. Miguel's unwavering support of his son, combined with the early release, reignited rumors and conspiracy theories surrounding the case. The trial, already controversial, was now mired in fresh speculation. Some began to question whether Rodrigo was truly guilty, while others clung to the belief that Leonardo Radakovich, the bookstore owner and earlier suspect, was the real killer. Despite the court's ruling, the events of January 19, 2007 remain shrouded in mystery. To this day, the full truth of what happened that fateful night has never been definitively uncovered. Some details of the crime have remained elusive, leading many to believe that the true murderer may still be free. The unsolved murder of Ruben Oliva, the man who found Natalia's belongings and was later found dead at the foot of a cliff, has only added to the lingering doubts. His death, which many believe to be connected to Natalia's murder, was never solved. This loose end continues to fuel theories that the killer is still at large. The case of Natalia Martinez has since become one of the most controversial and debated trials in Uruguayan history. Many feel that justice was never fully served, and for some, there remains a deep-seated fear that the person responsible for both Natalia's and Ruben's deaths has yet to face the consequences of their actions. A quiet neighborhood was shattered by a crime so brutal, it defied comprehension. What began as an ordinary December night would soon unravel into one of the most complex, disturbing cases investigators had ever encountered. Behind closed doors, a woman's life and that of her unborn child were extinguished with a ferocity that left police and neighbors alike reeling. This was not just premeditated murder. It was psychological warfare, taunting, chilling in its detail. As police dove deeper, chilling patterns emerged. The killer's methodical use of digital manipulation left even seasoned detectives stunned. Finally, as the truth neared the surface, one question remained. How far would he go to keep his secrets buried, and what new horrors might he yet be willing to unleash? Lan, Northern Ireland, December 2022. Natalie McNally, a vibrant 32-year-old with a zest for life and a passion for her community, was the cherished daughter of Noel and Bernadette McNally and the beloved sister to her three brothers, Brendan, Dean, and Niall. Being the only girl, she held a special place in the family and was often affectionately called the Princess by Niall. Quick-witted, fiercely independent, and highly motivated, Natalie's path took her first into law, though she ultimately found her calling in marketing. She worked diligently at TransLink, the major bus and rail services provider in Northern Ireland. Outside her professional life, Natalie's passions were uncomplicated yet fulfilling. She loved jigsaw puzzles, reading, sports, and taking long walks with her loyal dog, River. Her devotion extended far beyond her own interests. Natalie was deeply engaged in her community, a true activist who participated regularly in local charity events and was well known at Belfast Pride, where her presence was as vibrant as her personality. Her advocacy wasn't limited to these events. She was also a voice for those with diabetes in Northern Ireland, a cause that was close to her heart as she had lived with type 1 diabetes since she was 3. Her best friend would describe her as tiny and gentle but assertive, with a strong voice when it came to things she cared about. When Natalie was passionate, she could be the loudest person in the room, her friend recounted. In her personal life, Natalie was in a budding and meaningful relationship with 33-year-old Stephen McCullough. Though the couple had only been together a short while, they were deeply in love and thrilled to find out they were expecting a child. The news of the pregnancy was a cherished secret Natalie shared with only her parents. She had been planning a heartwarming Christmas surprise to reveal the news to her brothers, who would soon become uncles. For her parents, this baby would be their first grandchild, marking an exciting new chapter for the whole family. On December 18th, Natalie spent a relaxing day with her parents and her dog, River, watching Argentina battle France in the World Cup final. It was an ideal day, filled with warmth and joy, and Bernadette recalled how happy Natalie seemed. A baby on the way, Christmas nearly here, and plans to enjoy some well-earned holiday time. Still, a shift awaited her the following day at TransLink, so despite her reluctance to leave, she gathered her things, bundled River into the car, and waved goodbye, promising, "Mommy, I'll see you Monday or Tuesday." She was headed back to her home in the Silverwood Green area of Lurgan, where she lived with her dog and 2 cats. Once home, she checked social media and noticed a post from Stephen, who was gearing up for a significant Christmas livestream on YouTube. With nearly 40,000 followers, Stephen's channel was well established, showcasing his passion for gaming, reviews, and all things tech-related. This livestream marked his first in almost a year, an event he hoped would rekindle the connection he had with his audience. Natalie gave his post a like and wished him luck via text, promising that she might tune in to watch him live. After tending to her pets, she prepared for a quiet evening in, a peaceful close to her fulfilling day. But the following morning, a sense of worry began to creep in. Natalie hadn't shown up for work at TransLink, and her absence was immediately out of character. Her phone calls went unanswered, and as the day drifted into evening, her silence became more alarming. At around 10 p.m., Stephen, living about 20 minutes away, decided to check on her, troubled by the thought that something might be wrong, especially given her pregnancy. However, upon entering her home, Stephen was met with a horrifying sight. There were signs of a brutal struggle. Blood covered the floors and walls, revealing that Natalie had suffered a violent attack. She was found lifeless, with gruesome marks of violence on her body. Natalie McNally had barely stirred awake when the phone rang at 5:30 a.m., jolting him into a state of unease. Early morning calls often bring unwelcome news, but the magnitude of what he heard was unimaginable. On the other end of the line, his father struggled to speak through tears, while his mother's devastated screams echoed in the background, shouting that his sister, Natalie, was dead. It felt surreal, an out-of-body experience that left Niall's mind reeling. The harshness of the truth didn't fully sink in until he joined his family to identify Natalie's body, a task that no one should have to endure. When Niall and his father, Noel, finally saw Natalie, they were overwhelmed. Noel could barely recognize his daughter due to the severity of her injuries, her face obscured by bruises and cuts from the brutal attack she had suffered. The trauma of that sight would linger with them, an image they could never unsee. The autopsy revealed the extent of the horror. Natalie had suffered blunt force trauma, had been beaten and strangled, and was stabbed multiple times. Her body bore defensive wounds, clear signs of a desperate struggle to survive. Tragically, it was also confirmed that Natalie was pregnant with a boy, a baby she would have named Dean in honor of her brother. She had been just 3 days away from a scheduled scan that would have confirmed the gender, a special moment she had planned to share with her mother, Bernadette. The loss of Natalie and her unborn child was a double tragedy that tore through the family and left the community reeling. Natalie's murder set in motion a major investigation led by detectives from the Police Service of Northern Ireland's PSNI Major Investigation Team. The Silverwood Green neighborhood in Lurgan, where Natalie lived, quickly became the center of a murder inquiry, with authorities urgently seeking answers. Natalie's death, violent and senseless, shook the entire town and sent shockwaves far beyond. A detective made a heartfelt appeal to the public. If anyone has information about this brutal crime, please come forward. We are especially interested in any motorists traveling along Killen Road, Lurgan, on the night of December 18 between 8:45 and 9:45 p.m. If you captured any dashcam footage, even if it seems insignificant, it may help us understand what happened. The detectives left no stone unturned, scrutinizing every lead and clue, hoping to bring justice for Natalie and the child she was carrying. When Stephen McCullough, Natalie's boyfriend, reported finding her body, investigators treated him with due caution given the nature of the crime. As the first to discover the scene, he was understandably distressed and shaken. Officers questioned him thoroughly, and he explained he had been home all evening on the night of the murder, live streaming on his YouTube channel from 6 p.m. until midnight. A video gaming enthusiast, Stephen had built a following of nearly 40,000 subscribers, and that night's stream was supposed to be a special Christmas event, his first live session in nearly a year. He had planned it meticulously, hoping to entertain his audience with humor and nostalgia. When his stream began, he greeted viewers cheerfully. "Hey, and we're live. Good evening to all of you on this fine Sunday," he said, raising a glass in the Christmas spirit. I thought, what better way to kick off Christmas week than by spending it with you all? You know, life's been hectic. Work and, well, personal stuff, but here we are, finally. So grab a drink, because this might be my last stream until next year. He laughed, then admitted he was streaming from an outdated computer that was on its last legs. He confessed he had been cutting back on drinking, especially with Natalie's pregnancy, but decided to indulge that night given the occasion. By the time he signed off around midnight, Stephen was intoxicated and went straight to bed. When he awoke the next morning, he was groggy, struggling with a hangover, and entirely unaware of the horror that had taken place in Natalie's home. The PSNI investigators reviewed Stephen's live stream footage carefully, verifying that he had indeed remained online the entire evening, his interaction with viewers uninterrupted. This digital record corroborated his account and effectively placed him at home during the hours when Natalie was murdered. His behavior appeared consistent with someone who had been unaware of a tragic event unfolding miles away. Given his alibi, which was further supported by his online activity, Stephen was released without charge, and PSNI announced that he was not a suspect. Adding to the sorrow of that night, Natalie's loyal dog, River, who had been present in the home during the ordeal, was terrified by the commotion when Stephen arrived and ran out into the road, only to be hit by an oncoming car. The police conducted an exhaustive search for evidence, mindful of the devastating double loss, the promising life Natalie had led and the future she had envisioned with her son. The investigation pointed toward the tragic and bitter possibility that Natalie's murder might not be the act of a random intruder. There were no signs of forced entry, nor was there any indication that valuables had been stolen. This suggested that the person responsible for the attack could have been someone Natalie knew, someone with access to her home or a way of convincing her to open the door. As weeks turned into months, the Lurgan community rallied around the McNally family, showing solidarity through vigils and public support for the investigation. Fundraisers were organized to raise awareness about the crime and to aid the family in this time of need. Friends, family, and local activists, especially those who had campaigned alongside Natalie, gathered to honor her memory. Messages flooded social media, painting a picture of a kind-hearted, passionate woman who had touched countless lives through her activism and her spirit. The PSNI appeal for information persisted, with detectives hopeful that someone with critical information might yet come forward. For Noel, Bernadette, Niall, and the rest of Natalie's family, the loss was immeasurable. The investigation into Natalie McNally's murder revealed disturbing details that hinted at an attack both calculated and deeply personal. Police speculated that, on that fateful evening, Natalie had likely not yet locked her door. Her killer may have simply walked in without knocking, an unnervingly bold move if it were a random intruder, but one that seemed more plausible if the murderer had known her. The brutal nature of the attack suggested intense violence, and investigators assumed the assailant would have left covered in blood, requiring him to wash or dispose of clothing and shoes. This assumption prompted officers to search the area surrounding her neighborhood, particularly around Silverwood Golf Club, which bordered Kiln Road just behind Natalie's home. Shortly after the investigation began, police arrested her boyfriend, Stephen, though he was later released based on his alibi from his live stream that night. Suspicion then shifted to an unidentified man in his 40s, who was briefly held but quickly released on bail pending further inquiries. While suspicions arose around these individuals, the investigation remained inconclusive, with authorities keeping their options open. In the midst of this uncertainty, the tight-knit Lurgan community rallied around Natalie's family. Heartfelt vigils were held in the quiet cul-de-sac where she lived, and larger gatherings were organized, attracting widespread attention and support. A rally at Lurgan Park drew over 1,000 people, including Natalie's family and Stephen, who united with the community in mourning. The story gained significant media coverage, and even Natalie's favorite team, Everton Football Club, honored her memory by displaying a tribute at their matches. The team later installed a personalized stone at their new stadium, a meaningful gesture that brought a small bit of comfort to her family, as Natalie would forever be in a place she loved. Amid the holiday season's solemnity, the McNally family endured the unimaginable pain of holding a wake for Natalie on Christmas Day, followed by her funeral the next day. Within her coffin, her family placed precious mementos, photographs of her with her pets, symbols of her love and joy, and bibs she had recently bought for her unborn son, Dean. Stephen requested 20 minutes alone to say his goodbyes, a moment laden with grief and loss. While losing a loved one is never easy, the brutal timing, during a season typically associated with togetherness and joy, cast an even darker shadow over their loss. The presents Natalie had wrapped and placed under the family tree remained untouched, silent reminders of a life that had been abruptly stolen away. Bernadette described how those gifts seemed frozen in time, a stark symbol of a season turned into a nightmare. The police investigation, which grew more extensive by the day, saw hundreds of house-to-house inquiries, and officers painstakingly combed through an astounding 4,000 hours of CCTV footage. Several cars were seized for examination, and officers reached out to locals for dashcam footage that might offer even a glimmer of information. Crime Stoppers, a charity supporting crime prevention, offered a substantial reward of up to $20,000 for information that could help solve the case. As days turned to weeks and the investigation carried into the new year, police sought to engage the public directly by releasing specific surveillance footage that they believed might show Natalie's killer. Among the troves of video they analyzed, one clip emerged as critical. In this footage, police captured a man entering Silverwood Green, the street where Natalie lived, at 8:52 p.m. on December 18, the night of her murder. A little over half an hour later, at 9:30 p.m., the same individual was seen leaving, retracing his steps. The man was dressed in white shoes, a hat, and carried a rucksack, blending into the chilly December evening. Another camera, which police chose not to release to the public, showed him walking directly up to Natalie's door. His stride, calm and purposeful, suggested that he knew the area well. Police observed his composure as he walked back down the street, an unsettling sign that this had been a premeditated and targeted attack. This piece of footage became pivotal in the investigation, with authorities convinced that someone in the community would recognize the man in the video. They urged anyone with even the slightest inkling of who he might be to step forward. The investigation into this horrific murder is ongoing, police officials stated. We are keeping an open mind, but our primary line of inquiry is that the murder was carried out by someone Natalie knew. We ask anyone who thinks they recognize the individual in this footage to contact us immediately. Someone must know who he is. As the investigation continued, Natalie's friends and family faced an excruciating reality. Vigils and rallies became not only acts of remembrance, but also symbols of resilience and unity in a town shocked by such a tragedy. Friends, neighbors, and strangers alike left flowers, handwritten notes, and candles outside Natalie's home, creating a makeshift memorial. Messages poured in from across the country and beyond, with people sharing their own stories of loss and offering words of solace. By mid-January, police had painstakingly reconstructed much of Natalie's final movements. Investigators noted the layout of her neighborhood, pointing to specific blind spots in the surveillance network that may have allowed her killer to enter and leave without being seen by additional cameras. They also revisited witness statements, going over even the smallest details that could potentially lead them to the perpetrator. Yet despite these efforts, the absence of hard evidence continued to haunt the investigation. 6 weeks had passed since Natalie McNally's brutal murder, and her family and community were left frustrated and heartbroken by the lack of progress. Authorities were determined to uncover every possible lead, and while some clues had surfaced, there was still nothing definitive. Investigators had located a potential murder weapon, a knife found inside Natalie's home, which seemed to confirm that the killer had not brought their own weapon, but rather seized one already present in the house. Blood evidence also revealed a print from a marigold glove, suggesting that the killer may have used items within the house to aid in the crime. Stephen McCullough, Natalie's partner, had provided police with the name of her ex-boyfriend as a possible suspect. But this lead had fizzled out. The ex-boyfriend had a confirmed alibi for the night of the murder, placing him out of town with reliable witnesses. The trail was growing cold, and detectives worried that Natalie's killer may have already fled Northern Ireland. If that were the case, tracking them down across borders would be a monumental challenge. Faced with these dead ends, investigators pivoted their focus back to the heart of the investigation, examining those closest to Natalie with even greater scrutiny. One detective noted that, typically, most cases found resolution within a week or so. This case, however, remained complex and elusive, with hidden elements and behaviors among individuals that set off alarm bells. As police went through collected devices, it became clear that Stephen's own behavior warranted closer inspection. Since the initial investigation, Stephen had shown an unusual lack of engagement. He hadn't once approached the detectives for updates on the investigation, nor did he show any outward concern for justice in Natalie's case. This apathy appeared suspicious, leading police to seize his devices for further examination. Natalie's family had only met Stephen a handful of times, and while they knew little about him, they grew wary after her death. As the police examined his electronic devices, they discovered a potentially groundbreaking clue that unraveled his previously rock-solid alibi: his 6-hour gaming livestream from the night Natalie was killed. He had told detectives that he was live streaming a Violent Night Christmas live gaming stream that evening, creating a seemingly unbreakable alibi. Wearing a Christmas hat, drinking beer, and interacting minimally with viewers, he appeared to be broadcasting live. The stream's description on YouTube even reinforced this, reading, "Celebrate the happiest time of the year. Merry Christmas." But as police delved into his devices, they realized that the stream had not been live at all. Stephen had actually pre-recorded the entire 6-hour stream days earlier on December 14 and scheduled it to play automatically on December 18 from 6 p.m. to midnight, the precise hours when the murder took place. Minutes after the video went live, Stephen deleted the pre-recorded file from his computer, attempting to cover his tracks. Throughout the stream, he repeatedly apologized for his inability to interact in the chat, claiming his computer was having technical issues. This seemingly benign excuse allowed him to avoid real-time interaction, making it appear as though technical glitches were to blame rather than his actual absence. The more digital forensics experts analyzed the recording, the more disturbing the evidence became. It was clear that Stephen had gone to chilling lengths to fabricate his alibi. Investigators noted a key moment in the stream around 9:15 p.m., where the typical title card reading "Live Stream Back Soon" was briefly replaced with an image of the James Bond film No Time to Die. This was the exact time when neighbors recalled hearing a scream from Natalie's house, suggesting that this moment aligned with her tragic final moments. The grim realization struck investigators. Stephen's alibi wasn't just flimsy, it was methodically falsified. While police didn't release every detail to the public, they continued building their case with newfound confidence. Surveillance footage also revealed a chilling consistency between Stephen's movements and the man spotted near Natalie's home on the night of her murder. One clip showed a man resembling Stephen calmly entering Natalie's street at 8:52 p.m., minutes before her last known moments. Just over 30 minutes later, at 9:30 p.m., the same man was seen walking back down the street, carrying a rucksack and dressed in attire similar to what Stephen was known to wear. Additional CCTV footage showed him waiting at a bus stop near Kingsway, Dunmurry, approximately 15 minutes before heading to Natalie's home, further strengthening the case against him. He entered the bus with the hood of his coat pulled low and a mask obscuring his face, carrying an Asda bag for life in one hand. As he boarded, he dropped a few coins on the floor, bending down and, in the process, briefly removing one of his black gloves. Beneath it, detectives would later observe, was a yellow marigold glove, identical to the one whose print had been left in blood at Natalie's home. Throughout the bus ride, he maintained a motionless demeanor, only moving occasionally to lift his mask slightly to sip from a can of Coke. Passengers might have noticed his stillness, but in the anonymity of public transport, he was just another quiet commuter. When he exited the bus, the Asda bag still in hand, he walked purposefully, heading toward the railway station near Natalie's neighborhood. By 8:42 p.m., CCTV footage captured him again, this time even closer to her street. Moments later, he vanished from the camera's view, entering a 10-minute gap during which the Asda bag would disappear, replaced with a black rucksack. The whereabouts of the bag, and whatever it may have contained, remains a mystery. But the timing of its disappearance aroused suspicion, aligning with the estimated window of Natalie's death. Leaving her street at 9:30 p.m., the man proceeded toward Lurgan Town Center, walking calmly as though he were merely finishing a routine evening stroll. His face still obscured, he approached a taxi service outside a local pub, flagged down a car, and settled into the back seat. The cab had been pre-booked via a phone app, but Stephen redirected the driver to an alternate destination, citing an emergency. He claimed his mother was ill and he needed to get home as soon as possible. This explanation, while compelling in the moment, would later seem like just another crafted layer in his elaborate alibi. The driver recounted to police that he dropped Stephen off near what would later be identified as his home address at precisely 11:13 p.m. A key timestamp, given that Stephen was still supposedly live on YouTube at that exact moment. Just 3 minutes after the driver left him, Stephen's phone, which had been inactive for more than 5 hours, suddenly registered as manually unlocked, a detail too coincidental to ignore, further aligning him with the man in the footage. The taxi driver was later called in to identify Stephen, recognizing him immediately as his late-night passenger. Throughout the investigation, the police had played their cards close to their chest, wary of compromising the case with premature arrests. They knew they had to ensure every detail was thoroughly corroborated, given the web of deceit and technology behind this alleged crime. They had released Stephen once before, but this time they needed undeniable proof, especially given how meticulously Stephen had woven together an alibi. The final moments of Stephen's live stream were eerie in hindsight, revealing a man who, despite his outward calm, was possibly engaged in an elaborate act of deception. As he neared the end of the stream, his tone softened, and he spoke to his viewers with uncharacteristic sentimentality. "I think I'll end this stream when none of you are watching by just wishing everyone a Merry Christmas," he said. He spoke about the holiday's essence, about preserving love and passing it on, and about how the joy of Christmas changes from youthful excitement to something quieter, more reflective. "Christmas isn't about shopping and lights and tinsel and all that nonsense," he mused. "It's about spending a little time, enjoying time with the people you love." Then, with a simple, "good night," he ended the stream, sealing what he must have hoped was an ironclad alibi. But on February 2, 2023, the community was shaken as the authorities officially charged Stephen McCullough, Natalie's partner and the father of her unborn child, with her murder. The charge brought disbelief to many, particularly given Stephen's apparent involvement with her grieving family and his public appearances. His lawyer immediately filed for bail, arguing that the pre-recorded stream was standard practice due to Stephen's computer issues and did not imply guilt. He insisted that many streamers pre-record content, and Stephen's decision to do so should not automatically implicate him in Natalie's murder. "Pre-recording doesn't make someone a killer," his lawyer contended, pointing out that live streaming equipment still required the operator's presence to function. The defense's arguments emphasized Stephen's lack of criminal history and his strong community ties, portraying him as a model citizen who, they argued, posed no risk to society. "He comes before the court with no record. He comes before the court with ties to the community and with his own address. I would ask this court to find that he is a suitable candidate for bail," his lawyer argued. Despite these pleas, the judge denied the bail request, voicing grave concerns over the calculated nature of the crime. "If he can carry out an attack like this," she stated, "who knows what else he's capable of?" She went on to highlight the sophistication and planning that had gone into the alleged crime, expressing her unease over the potential for Stephen to interfere with the investigation using his advanced technological knowledge. Meanwhile, the prosecution emphasized the chilling extent of Stephen's alleged premeditation, deceit, and efforts to cover his tracks. They argued that this level of planning was rarely seen in the jurisdiction, pointing to his methodical approach as evidence of a deeply calculated mind. Authorities underscored the evidence, from the timing of the pre-recorded video to the precise moment his phone unlocked just after the taxi ride, as well as the cab driver's identification and the glove print that matched what was found in Natalie's blood. The prosecution painted a picture of a man who, in their view, had carefully orchestrated each step to evade detection, exploiting technology and his position in Natalie's life. The case also sparked a renewed public conversation about the responsibilities of social media platforms and the ethical obligations they bear. Discussions on data tracking, privacy, and digital alibis circulated widely, with people increasingly aware of the fine line between privacy rights and the need for accountability in a world where technology can be manipulated in dangerous ways. As the investigation continued, authorities worked to build an airtight case, piecing together the intricate layers of Stephen's alleged deception. Forensics experts and digital analysts tirelessly examined every detail, determined to uncover the full scope of his actions. New revelations in the case suggested that Stephen McCullough had covertly left his phone in the home of Natalie McNally's family, capturing their private conversations for nearly an hour. Authorities believe this recording was likely an attempt to gauge their suspicions, giving him insight into their thoughts so he could adjust his behavior accordingly. Although the prosecution could not definitively determine his motivations, they presented evidence that Stephen had consistently attempted to monitor and manipulate Natalie's life from afar. He had even gained access to her personal phone, knowing her passcode, allowing him a disturbing degree of control over her private communications. According to the prosecution, evidence suggests that on December 15th, just days before her murder, Natalie was in contact with a former boyfriend. The communication, they believe, may have triggered Stephen's violent jealousy. The prosecution argued that this sexualized contact, not only with this particular individual but also with others, could have acted as the catalyst for the horrific events that unfolded. Stephen reportedly accessed her phone 9 times to review her messages, check her activity on WhatsApp, and even monitor her Twitter interactions. From these moments, the prosecution alleged, Stephen began methodically planning his attack, quickly moving to stage a live-stream alibi that would ostensibly exonerate him. Just hours after viewing her messages, he pre-recorded a video designed to play out as though it were happening live. In court, the prosecution described Stephen's actions as chilling, noting the subtle details he had woven into the video, almost as if taunting authorities. "The devil is in the detail," the prosecutor said. They emphasized that Stephen's pre-recorded live stream contained embedded messages and eerie hints of his intentions. The degree of premeditation in Natalie's murder, they argued, was shocking. Stephen's actions weren't a crime of passion, but rather a meticulously calculated scheme that involved constructing a false alibi down to the smallest details. Beyond the staged live stream, which authorities assert was designed to mislead investigators, prosecutors presented further evidence of Stephen's intent to mislead and control. For example, Stephen's November 2022 search history included disturbing queries such as, "In a gunshot execution, which hurts more, being shot in the head or the heart?" And, "Which is less painful, drowning or burning alive?" These searches, while not directly linked to Natalie's death, suggested a morbid curiosity about suffering and indicated an unusual preoccupation with methods of violence, foreshadowing the brutality that would follow. Although Stephen would eventually concede that his stream on the night of Natalie's murder was pre-recorded, he continued to deny responsibility for the crime itself. He claimed he had been alone that night, drinking in his house and eventually falling asleep. However, the prosecution found this explanation unconvincing, especially when paired with the extensive lengths he allegedly went to in creating his alibi. In addition to the prosecution's technological evidence, further discoveries surfaced about Stephen's online behavior and digital footprint. The prosecution later unveiled social media interactions and additional recorded content where Stephen would indirectly mention events in his life, including cryptic comments that, in retrospect, seemed eerily connected to Natalie's death. For instance, videos emerged where Stephen spoke about betrayal and loyalty, almost foreshadowing his obsessive and jealous behaviors. These details, while not directly incriminating, cast a dark shadow over his character, suggesting a mind engrossed in possessiveness and control. During a pre-trial hearing, Stephen's defense team requested that the trial be moved to Belfast, citing the case's heavy reliance on CCTV and complex technology. As Stephen, now 34, was let out of the dock in handcuffs, he made no eye contact with Natalie's family, who watched in silence from the public gallery. The grief in the room was palpable, yet Stephen maintained his stoic demeanor, refusing to acknowledge the emotional devastation around him. The timeline for the trial was pushed further out than initially anticipated, with the judge citing the case's complexity, given the advanced technology used by Stephen. The earliest potential start date was now set for September 2024. Police emphasized the extraordinary measures Stephen allegedly took to not only commit the crime, but also to cover it up so meticulously. However, when the court convened in September, the jury was ultimately unable to reach a verdict, leaving the case unresolved and prolonging the anguish for Natalie's family and friends. The charges against Stephen McCullough, who is accused of murdering his pregnant partner, have become a focal point of national attention. Natalie, who was 15 weeks pregnant at the time of her death, suffered multiple stab wounds, neck compression, and blunt force trauma to the head. The brutality of her injuries underscored the prosecution's argument that this was a premeditated, rage-driven attack. The court repeatedly denied Stephen's bail requests, citing not only the serious nature of the allegations, but also concerns about his potential ability to influence the case. His media mastery, as the court termed it, suggested he might attempt to interfere with the justice process if granted release. The judge, aware of the family's prolonged agony and the unresolved nature of the case, announced that the trial would begin on May 6, 2025. The delay added to the emotional burden on Natalie's family, who had endured months of speculation, court appearances, and the weight of the public eye. He saw himself as a savior, someone who could provide everything she needed. Money, security, even love, or so he convinced himself. She thought that money was her main goal in life. There are no easy answers in this story, but there is love, money, and death. Georgina Simons was born and raised in Newport, a lively Welsh town where she grew up surrounded by the daily hustle and laughter of her three brothers. In a household filled with boisterous personalities, she learned early on to be assertive and determined, qualities that soon blossomed into an unshakable confidence. Her family wasn't well off, so Georgina grew up understanding that if she wanted anything, she would have to work for it. She left school at 16, choosing the immediate prospect of employment over the uncertainty of academics. Her first job, a position at a call center, allowed her to earn her own money, though she soon realized it was a far cry from the life she envisioned. Alongside this job, Georgina enrolled in cosmetology courses, fascinated by the world of beauty and transformation. Shortly after, Georgina met Derek, a calm and stable man just 6 years older, whose grounded nature offered her a vision of security. Their relationship grew quickly, and within a year, at just 18, she gave birth to their daughter, Emily. Motherhood arrived like a gust of wind, leaving her exhilarated but also overwhelmed by the responsibilities and sacrifices it demanded. Adjusting to life as a young mother, Georgina moved into Derek's mother's house. Although grateful for a roof over their heads, she felt stifled in the modest, aging home with its perpetually damp walls and creaky floors. Her call center job provided just enough to get by, but each morning she awoke with a gnawing sense that she was meant for more. While Derek seemed content with their small, predictable world, Georgina's dissatisfaction grew, and so did her dreams of a life filled with luxury and excitement. Derek, a homebody who valued stability, had little interest in the extravagance or adventure that called to Georgina. Where he found peace in routine, she felt imprisoned, yearning for freedom and abundance. She voiced her frustrations often, talking about how hard they worked just to make ends meet. She knew Derek loved her, but his lack of ambition wore on her spirit, driving her to consider paths she had never imagined. Her desire to escape her ordinary life became her motivation. She began to pour her energy into her appearance, almost as if reinventing herself could create a bridge to a new life. Georgina soon embarked on a full transformation, reshaping herself in the image of the glamorous women she admired from afar. She spent hours perfecting her makeup, styling her hair, and refining her wardrobe, selecting clothes that accentuated her features in ways that demanded attention. Not long after, she underwent 2 breast augmentations, liposuction, and experimented with cosmetic enhancements that added to her allure. These changes opened doors into a world that had once seemed distant and unreachable. Georgina discovered burlesque and exotic dance, taking lessons that helped her embrace her body with confidence. Soon, she was performing at private dance clubs, her every move carefully crafted to captivate her audience. Here, she earned in one night what she would have made in a week at the call center, and with each paycheck, her hunger for a life of wealth and freedom intensified. With her newfound financial independence, Georgina managed to move herself, Derek, and their daughter out of his mother's house and into their own apartment. For the first time, she felt a spark of autonomy, a taste of the life she wanted. But it wasn't enough. The apartment, while an improvement, felt like just another stepping stone on her path to something greater. Her ambitions continued to grow, fueled by the luxury that now felt tantalizingly close. As her income from the club plateaued, Georgina began contemplating the next step, working as a high-end escort. She rationalized it as a way to secure a better future for Emily, her desire for financial freedom overriding any hesitations. In secret, she registered on an app under the alias Hannah James, presenting herself as a confident and alluring woman with specific skills, offering exclusive services to wealthy clients. She knew her looks and charm would attract attention, and she was right. Her profile gained popularity, her inbox filled with inquiries from men intrigued by the allure she projected. The app quickly became her gateway into an entirely different world, one that promised the lifestyle she craved. Derek was aware of Georgina's decision but was conflicted. While he loved her deeply, the risks and moral questions surrounding her work weighed on him. However, his desire to keep her in his life and his fear of losing her to this new path led him to a reluctant compromise. They agreed to an open relationship with strict boundaries that kept her activities hidden from their families and friends. This arrangement created a veil of secrecy that shielded their lives from scrutiny, and Georgina slipped seamlessly into her double life. Georgina's new identity as Hannah James quickly became popular. She knew how to tailor her presence to appeal to men like Peter Morgan, men who sought escape, adventure, and the thrill of being with a woman who could fulfill their fantasies. Peter Morgan, a man who spent most of his life in relative comfort and control. Born in 1962 on a sprawling 300-acre farm near Newport, Peter was no stranger to wealth or influence. From a young age, he understood that his life path had already been sketched out for him by generations before him. He would work the land, manage the family farm, and live a stable, predictable life, much like his parents before him. A midlife crisis began to take shape, seeping into his thoughts and driving him to live differently. No longer content with the simple, structured life he once held, Peter felt an urge to experience life in ways that were extravagant, thrilling, even reckless. What began as minor indulgences soon snowballed into something far more consuming. Peter purchased luxury cars, a Ferrari, a Lamborghini, and acquired an enormous mansion, filling it with symbols of excess, from a restored military tank to a private helicopter. But these outward signs of his wealth and influence only hinted at deeper changes brewing within him, changes that would shift his life in unimaginable directions. It was on a business trip to Amsterdam that Peter first tasted a life entirely separate from his rural roots. At a private club, in a haze of music and low-lit allure, he crossed a personal boundary, paying a performer for services that awakened in him an insatiable desire for experiences beyond his marriage and family life. This singular act of infidelity was just the beginning of a pattern that would soon consume him. From then on, Peter balanced a double life. He maintained the appearance of a devoted husband and father while indulging in secret, forbidden pleasures that became more elaborate and more frequent with each passing month. Peter's life took yet another turn in 2011, when a friend introduced him to an app that connected clients with elite escorts. To Peter, this was an invitation into a world where fantasies could become reality with a mere swipe. Obsessed, he threw himself into this digital world, scrolling through profiles and arranging clandestine meetings across the country, from Newport to Cardiff. Each encounter was unique, and he had a rule: never see the same woman twice. This ensured that he could keep his escapades purely physical, devoid of emotion, and easily hidden from his family. His wife, Helen, remained blissfully unaware, wrapped up in her own world of responsibilities and obligations. Peter's skill at deception was finely honed. Each business trip was simply another disguise for his double life. Then came 2012, and with it, Peter's 50th birthday. A milestone that seemed to spur him toward even more dangerous desires. In May 2012, Peter Morgan, a wealthy entrepreneur struggling with the emptiness of his midlife, came across Georgina Simon's profile. He was instantly captivated by her image, and something in her eyes seemed to echo his own unspoken desires. He arranged a meeting, and on their first date, they had dinner together, making casual conversation that seemed to draw them closer with each passing minute. Peter was fascinated not only by Georgina's beauty, but by her wit, her self-assuredness, and the sense of mystery that enveloped her. She held his attention in a way few others had, and he found himself willing to pay any price for her company. That evening, their interaction began simply. He paid her a modest sum for a kiss. But by the morning, the transaction had evolved into something far more significant. For Peter, this wasn't just another rendezvous. It was the beginning of an obsession. Georgina, however, approached it purely as business, another opportunity to inch closer to the luxurious life she wanted. For Peter, this wasn't just another encounter. It felt like a revival of his youth, a chance to rekindle the spirit he feared was fading with age. What started as occasional, impersonal rendezvous quickly evolved. Their encounters increased from once a month to once a week, and Peter, wealthy and accustomed to getting what he wanted, didn't flinch at the escalating costs. It became clear that he wasn't just paying for her time. He was paying to keep her close, to experience the intimacy and thrill he found so rare in his life. As their time together grew, so did Peter's affections. He began to feel that his attraction to her had become more than just physical. Soon, their dates extended beyond their usual hotel rooms to the world outside. Peter wanted to share experiences with her, to escape the confines of their clandestine encounters. They dined at fine restaurants, caught late-night movie screenings, and spent long evenings laughing over glasses of wine. Georgina became the center of his fantasies, and Peter started to see her as more than just an escort. She was a companion, someone who filled a profound void in his life. Peter's feelings for Georgina blossomed into something that bordered on obsession. The boundaries between their transactional relationship and his emotional attachment blurred, especially as he began to shower her with gifts meant to prove his affection. He bought her designer clothes, luxurious jewelry, and extravagant shoes, each present an attempt to bind her closer to him. He even went so far as to gift her a red Ferrari, a symbol of the fast-paced, glamorous life he wanted her to enjoy by his side. For one weekend when his family was away, he paid her a staggering $10,000 just to spend the weekend with him in his own home. A bold risk that underscored just how invested he had become. In his mind, these gifts were acts of devotion, expressions of his desire for her companionship and his eagerness to integrate her into his world. Helen, his wife, remained oblivious to the drama unfolding in her own home. To Peter, Helen's absence during these weekends felt liberating, as if a weight had been lifted, allowing him to indulge in the fantasy that Georgina could one day replace his wife entirely. But for Georgina, their affair was business and nothing more. She accepted his gifts with grace but felt no deeper connection to him. Her focus remained firmly on the financial stability he provided, an arrangement she calculated to benefit her and her daughter. Beyond that, she harbored no interest in Peter's growing affection or his attempts to bring her closer. To her, he was just a wealthy man willing to pay for her time, and she continued to see other clients with no remorse. Even her boyfriend Derek remained a fixture in her life, a constant shadow that Peter neither saw nor acknowledged. Despite her lack of emotional attachment, Peter's jealousy flared whenever he thought of Georgina's other clients. The idea of her being with anyone else was intolerable, so he devised a solution: exclusivity. He offered her an exorbitant monthly payment of $133,000, an amount so substantial that Georgina could comfortably cover all her expenses, allowing her to turn down other clients and dedicate herself solely to him. She agreed, knowing she would earn more from this arrangement than from juggling multiple clients. The financial security appealed to her pragmatism, and she accepted his offer, marking the beginning of an arrangement that would entangle both their lives in ways they hadn't foreseen. With exclusivity came a shift in their dynamic. To ensure privacy and control, Peter moved her into a small bungalow on his estate, ostensibly for her safety and that of her daughter, though it was just as much about keeping her isolated. The primary house, a grand but aging mansion, was off-limits, as Peter insisted it was uninhabitable. Her boyfriend Derek was strictly forbidden from setting foot on the estate, a rule Peter enforced to maintain his grip on Georgina's life. In his mind, he was crafting a fairy tale for her, one where she was the princess and he, the benevolent benefactor. He transformed the bungalow into a luxurious haven, complete with anything she could possibly need. But while Peter envisioned this as a paradise, to Georgina, it began to feel more like a gilded cage, a life controlled and monitored by a man who mistook his wealth for ownership. For 3 years, Peter filled her world with lavish comforts, taking her on trips to London, Cape Town, and across Europe. He indulged her every whim, funded cosmetic treatments, and splurged on extravagant vacations meant to dazzle her. They spent their days riding ATV, strolling down manicured paths, and watching movies in a private theater he had arranged for her enjoyment. He even planned family-like activities for them, despite the lack of genuine family ties. In his mind, she was no longer an escort, but a fixture in his life, someone he treated almost as a second wife. But Peter's vision of an idyllic life couldn't mask the strain building beneath the surface. Georgina, while enjoying the luxuries, felt increasingly confined. She played along, maintaining her role and offering Peter the illusion of a relationship, but her thoughts remained distant. She never allowed herself to reciprocate his feelings, understanding that her role was to provide a fantasy, not reality. Peter's grand gestures and relentless attention had not broken through her emotional defenses. To her, this arrangement was temporary, a means to achieve financial freedom, but she never saw it as permanent. Meanwhile, her boyfriend, Derek, struggled with the new distance that had crept into their relationship. He noticed her growing detachment, the way her priorities had shifted. The longer she stayed with Peter, the less time she spent with Derek, and it tore at his sense of self-worth. Derek, once content with their life together, now felt inadequate, as if he were a mere placeholder. He couldn't compete with Peter's wealth or the lifestyle she now enjoyed. Desperate to bridge the gap, Derek began a transformation of his own, determined to rekindle the spark they once shared. He started working out, obsessively chasing a physical ideal he thought would make him more appealing to her. He bought designer clothes he could barely afford, whitened his teeth, and adopted a polished, sophisticated appearance, hoping to win back her attention. Yet his efforts felt futile. He could sense that Georgina's interest in him had waned, overshadowed by the allure of the life Peter provided. The relationship he valued now seemed to be slipping through his fingers, leaving him feeling lost and betrayed. The harsh reality was that no amount of self-improvement could match the luxury and security Peter offered her. Derek was a man grounded in love and loyalty, but these qualities felt insufficient in the face of her growing materialism. As the months passed, the strain between them became almost unbearable. Derek found himself questioning the life they had shared, wondering if it had all been an illusion. For Georgina, the once unremarkable life she had led with him seemed like a distant memory, a chapter she felt no obligation to return to. The luxurious estate, the gifts, the high-end lifestyle, all served to further separate her from the man who had once been her anchor. And for Derek, the painful truth grew clearer with every passing day. He had lost her to a world he could never touch, a world crafted by a man whose wealth and control had slowly erased the connection they once shared. Yet beneath the illusion of happiness and wealth, the cracks in Peter and Georgina's relationship grew deeper. Their fairy tale existence was precarious, built on Peter's obsessive need for control and Georgina's calculated indifference. The isolated estate, intended to be a sanctuary, had become a theater of quiet tensions and unspoken truths. For Peter, every smile she gave, every touch she allowed, reinforced his fantasy. But for Georgina, each interaction reminded her of the cost of her freedom and of the price she had paid to escape one life, only to find herself trapped in another. Helen Morgan had always known her husband, Peter, led a complex and sometimes secretive life. But over the years, she'd learned to ignore the red flags that cropped up occasionally. Sudden business trips, unexplained absences, and an emotional distance that settled between them like a quiet storm. For a long time, she convinced herself that these suspicions were simply part of the sacrifices they made for the lifestyle they both enjoyed. Yet everything shifted one evening when Helen found an incriminating receipt hidden among Peter's belongings. A receipt for an extravagant bouquet addressed to a woman she had never heard of. For Helen, This was the proof she'd been both seeking and dreading. She now knew her husband's betrayal was more than a suspicion. It was reality. The discovery cut deep, but Helen made a calculated choice. She didn't confront Peter outright. Instead, she distanced herself, building an invisible wall between them and focusing on the familiar comforts of her daily routine. She grew colder, reserving her warmth and energy for her children and the few activities that brought her solace. She buried herself in charity events, social gatherings, and her morning rituals, filling her days with a structured, carefully maintained schedule. It was a silent resignation, a choice to live parallel lives rather than tear her family apart. To anyone on the outside, it looked like Helen was at peace with the arrangement, but only she knew the true toll it was taking on her heart. Meanwhile, Georgina, with her two competing worlds, had taken to referring to her two partners in a way that betrayed her own indifference. She began calling Peter Rich Pete and her longtime boyfriend simply Poor Pete. The distinction was humiliating for her boyfriend, who had already struggled with feelings of inadequacy. He'd poured himself into self-improvement, but nothing he did could match the allure of Peter's wealth and influence. Each time Georgina flippantly used these nicknames, it deepened his sense of failure, further reminding him that, in her eyes, he would never measure up. Inside the opulent walls of Peter's estate, life continued in a surreal bubble of wealth and indulgence, completely isolated from reality. Peter funded Georgina's every need, paying her exorbitant fees that allowed her to maintain her lavish lifestyle. She no longer saw herself as a struggling single mother, but as someone who could afford the luxuries she had always dreamed of, though they came with a cost to her soul. To keep things interesting, Georgina started inviting other women into their encounters. She had become a master of keeping Peter entertained, knowing his wealth relied on his satisfaction. She was adept at reading his desires, picking women who would heighten his excitement while she remained the center of his attention. One night, while his wife and children were away, Peter invited Georgina and one of her escort friends to his family home. They spent the night in the marital bedroom, where Peter, caught up in the fantasy, asked one of the women to wear Helen's dress, pretending for a brief and twisted moment that his wife was part of the tryst. The idea of Helen joining this secret part of his life thrilled him, a twisted indulgence that he knew could never happen in real life. What Peter didn't know was that Georgina was secretly recording the entire night. She filmed everything, from her friend changing into Helen's dress to the events that unfolded in the bedroom. This footage would later serve as a weapon, a dangerous piece of leverage Georgina kept tucked away, aware of its potential consequences. For the time being, it was merely insurance, a safeguard should she ever need to protect herself. As their affair continued, Peter's life began to unravel. His obsession with Georgina strained every aspect of his personal life, and the repercussions spread quickly. Derek, her boyfriend, had reached his limit. His love for Georgina had once given him strength, but now, feeling replaced and utterly broken, he made the difficult decision to leave her. This decision marked the first major crack in Georgina's world. Though she was indifferent at first, Derek's absence left a hole she didn't know how to fill. He had been her anchor, the one consistent part of her life outside of her arrangement with Peter. Without him, her world started to feel emptier, even in all its lavishness. It wasn't long before Helen discovered the truth herself. She accidentally stumbled upon a series of explicit messages between her husband and Georgina, messages that shattered her remaining resolve. Confronted with undeniable proof of Peter's infidelity, Helen finally reached her breaking point. This time, she wouldn't stay silent. She confronted Peter, listening as he fumbled through excuses and half-hearted apologies, but her mind was made up. Helen filed for divorce, demanding a substantial portion of their assets, determined to leave him with as little as possible for the pain he had inflicted. For Georgina, life took a swift, tragic turn. In the span of months, two devastating events shook her to her core. The first tragedy struck in mid-2015, when her father took his own life. The news hit her like a wave, dragging her into depths of grief she had never known. She realized, in the wake of his passing, how much she had lost touch with the people who mattered most, her family bonds severed by the life she had chosen. Before she could even begin to process this loss, she was struck by a second tragedy. Her ex-boyfriend, Derek, who had struggled with depression after their breakup, took his own life. Found alone in a wooded area, he left behind only the ghost of a life once shared with Georgina and their daughter. The news broke her, leaving her to face the consequences of her decisions in the most painful way. With these losses, Georgina fell into a profound darkness. Once a confident, ambitious woman, she became a shadow of herself, plagued by grief and remorse. Alcohol and drugs became her refuge, numbing the relentless pain that haunted her. Her life spiraled into a bleak cycle of self-destruction, her lavish lifestyle now overshadowed by a pervasive despair that money could not ease. Her relationship with Peter deteriorated as well. The charm of wealth, once enough to keep her tethered to him, lost its allure. She began to pull away, refusing his attempts to keep her close. Peter, feeling the shift in her demeanor, became desperate to regain her attention. But it was too late. The person Georgina had once been was gone, replaced by someone barely holding on to life. The castle walls that had once felt grand and invincible became suffocating, trapping her in memories she longed to escape. In his attempts to salvage their relationship, Peter only drove her further away, his wealth and gifts now hollow symbols of a life she no longer desired. For Peter, Helen's departure and Georgina's emotional withdrawal marked the downfall of the carefully curated life he had tried so hard to control. He was left with a hollow existence, watching as everything he once valued slipped beyond his grasp. Meanwhile, Georgina, lost in a fog of guilt and regret, knew that her choices had come at an unimaginable cost, leaving her alone with memories that haunted her every waking moment. Deep down, Georgina harbored a growing resentment toward Peter. Though she rarely admitted it, even to herself, she blamed him for Derek's tragic death. She saw him as the catalyst that had upended her life, the one who had set her down a path she'd never fully chosen. To escape from Peter's relentless control, Georgina began seeking solace in the company of a longtime friend, someone she had known for years and trusted. Unlike her relationship with Peter, her connection with this man was one of genuine care and mutual respect. With him, she felt free from the expectations and pressures that now defined her life with Peter. In his presence, she rediscovered parts of herself that had been lost amid the trappings of wealth and the toll of the relentless lifestyle Peter had introduced her to. This new relationship grew, offering Georgina a way to reclaim her sense of identity. Peter, however, had become possessive, unable to tolerate the idea of Georgina seeking companionship elsewhere. In his mind, he had invested too much in her, his time, his wealth, and his affection. And he felt entitled to exclusive control over her life. He saw himself not only as her benefactor, but also as the person who provided for her and her daughter. His financial power over her, he believed, gave him the right to dictate the terms of her existence. He made sure she understood this, constantly reminding her of the countless expenses he had covered, each reminder layered with subtle threats to withdraw his support. But Georgina had reached a point where Peter's control no longer intimidated her. She grew defiant, refusing to submit to his demands, and their relationship became a tense, volatile standoff. At events, Georgina openly insulted him, her sharp words echoing across the gatherings, leaving Peter humiliated and seething. Her fiery personality, once part of what drew him to her, had now turned against him in ways he hadn't anticipated. To his friends, he made excuses for her behavior, passing it off as harmless rebellion. But each public confrontation chipped away at his pride, revealing cracks in his carefully constructed world. As her defiance grew, so did her self-destructive tendencies. Georgina turned to alcohol and drugs with increasing frequency, attempting to dull the pain and disappointment that had seeped into her life. The habit grew into a crutch, and soon, rumors about her troubled lifestyle reached the ears of Child Protective Services. Authorities, concerned for her daughter's welfare, launched an investigation to determine whether Georgina was fit to care for her child, Emily. For Georgina, this was a terrifying turn of events, one that brought her the bitter realization of how far her life had spiraled out of control. When she heard of the inquiry, her first thought was to blame Peter, convinced he was the one who had alerted social services in a twisted attempt to control her further. Despite the lack of any evidence linking him to the investigation, she was certain that Peter was behind it, and her mind began to fixate on this belief. The anger simmered into a fury that finally erupted in a confrontation. Their shouting match quickly became the center of a scandal, with accusations flying on both sides. For Peter, who thrived on control, Georgina's growing defiance and rage were unfathomable. He had never expected her to turn on him so dramatically. Determined to reassert his dominance, Peter resorted to extreme measures. He began to spy on her, unable to shake the feeling that he was losing her to someone else. Leveraging his access to the estate, he discreetly installed listening devices in the bungalow where Georgina lived. These devices were equipped with SIM cards, which allowed him to call into them and eavesdrop at any moment. Daily, Peter would dial into these devices, anxiously listening to hours of conversations, hoping to catch Georgina in some compromising situation or to hear proof of her supposed disloyalty. The eavesdropping soon morphed into an obsession, and he would sometimes call the devices up to 10 times a day, unable to shake the gnawing insecurity that consumed him. For over 2 months, the recordings yielded little but mundane conversations. Small talk with friends, moments with her daughter, and the occasional chat with a visitor. But on January 10th, 2016, Peter's suspicions finally paid off. That day, Georgina had a close friend over, and their conversation turned to Peter himself. When he called in to listen, he was shocked to hear Georgina speak openly about him, venting her frustrations and revealing just how unhappy she was. She admitted to her friend that her life with Peter had become unbearable, that she felt trapped by his financial support and haunted by his constant scrutiny. She even mentioned her belief that he was behind the child services inquiry, confirming Peter's worst fear, that Georgina saw him not as a protector or benefactor, but as an oppressor. Although the child services investigation had concluded with no findings against her, Georgina kept this information to herself. She saw in the inquiry an opportunity to manipulate Peter further, realizing that the mere threat of losing her daughter was enough to hold his attention and unlock his generosity. She began to exaggerate her fears, hinting that the situation was still unresolved, playing into Peter's sense of guilt and responsibility to extract more money. For her, this was survival. For Peter, it was a tightening leash. But Georgina's plans didn't stop there. As Peter listened, he was horrified to hear her lay out a more elaborate scheme. She told her friend that she intended to convince Peter to sign over the bungalow to her, planning to use it as leverage when she eventually left him. This, however, was only part of her plot. She confided that she possessed a compromising video from a night long ago, the recording she had taken of their intimate encounter with her friend dressed in Helen's clothes. When Peter heard Georgina's scheme in full, a chill settled over him as he realized just how deeply she had planned to dismantle his life. But in his desperation, Peter saw only one option left. He needed to regain control, no matter the cost. On the morning of January 11th, Peter started plotting his revenge, meticulously crafting a plan to stop Georgina from executing hers. The following day, his intentions became clear through his online search history. As he researched the tools, he might need to carry out his plan. By January 12th, Peter went to a hardware store, filling his cart with rope, zip ties, plastic bags, and rubber gloves. Each item he selected with methodical precision, his mind focused only on the steps he would take to reclaim what he felt he had lost. Once he returned to the estate, he didn't waste time. He headed directly to Georgina's bungalow, his heart pounding as he prepared to confront her. In a desperate attempt to salvage what remained of their twisted relationship, Peter even made one last reckless offer. He threw a stack of cash at her feet, promising everything she'd ever wanted: marriage, wealth, even a life insurance policy that would name her as the beneficiary. He told her she'd inherit $1 million if anything happened to him. But Georgina's face remained unchanged, cold and unyielding. Her refusal cut through him, but it was the hatred in her eyes that finally pushed him over the edge. She didn't see him as a lover or even a partner. In her mind, he was nothing more than a fool, a puppet she had manipulated for gain. Her rejection was laced with contempt, and with every word, his fury grew. Grabbing the rope he had brought, he looped it around her neck, initially intending only to intimidate her, to make her understand the seriousness of her actions. But when she laughed, taunting him and threatening that he would pay dearly for every hurt she had suffered, Peter's restraint vanished. In a blind rage, he tightened the rope, shutting his eyes and allowing his anger and frustration to dictate his actions. It was only when Georgina went still that he realized what he had done. Moving mechanically, Peter donned the rubber gloves, bound her wrists and ankles with zip ties, and wrapped her body in plastic. His mind buzzed with a singular focus: concealment. Transporting her to an old family property, Peter stashed her body in an outbuilding, convinced that no one would find her there. Yet in his haste, he overlooked crucial details. Security cameras, which he himself had installed on the estate, captured his every move, and Georgina's mobile phone, which he had neglected to turn off, continued to broadcast her location. By evening, when Georgina failed to pick up her daughter, her friends and family began to worry. Her absence was quickly noted, and by nightfall, the police had initiated a search. The investigation escalated rapidly, with Peter soon becoming the prime suspect. Initially, he tried to maintain a composed facade, telling officers that he had seen her around noon but that she had dismissed him afterward. However, the police traced Georgina's phone signal to his property, uncovering the lie. When detectives pressed him further, Peter attempted to shift the story, claiming he had taken Georgina's phone only to protect her from her own worsening habits. After hours of intense interrogation, Peter finally broke down, confessing to Georgina's death. He tried to paint himself as a man driven to the brink, pushed by desperation and betrayal. He claimed that he had offered her everything in an attempt to salvage their relationship, only to be met with cruelty and deceit. But his attempts at justification fell on unsympathetic ears. The evidence was overwhelming. His confession, the surveillance footage, and the tools he had purchased all pointed to premeditated intent. The trial of Peter Morgan quickly became a sensational case, drawing significant public attention. The media delved into every sordid detail, painting Peter as a man consumed by obsession, unable to let go of a relationship that had long been dead. Despite his initial confession, he later tried to argue for leniency, citing mental health issues and emotional turmoil in an attempt to reduce his charge to manslaughter. His defense team argued that he had been a man under extreme psychological strain, unable to think clearly in the face of Georgina's alleged betrayal. However, the prosecution countered with the extensive planning he had undertaken, including the hardware purchases and his calculated moves following the crime. The evidence was irrefutable, and the court was unswayed by his pleas. In the end, Peter Morgan was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 25 years before eligibility for parole.